Our topic today is how will the pandemic change the electric utilities industry regulatory bargain? For those of you who are not familiar with the Rutgers Center for Research in Regulated Industries, the mission of the center is to promote research, scholarship, and education in regulatory economics. The center has been in existence for more than 40 years, and it was founded by Dr. Michael Crew. The main focus is on utility regulation, and we cover the basic utilities, electric utilities, telecom, water, gas, and postal services. And that's what I just did. This webinar has four leading experts. We're going to discuss three basic questions. And the three basic questions are, how has the pandemic affected the electric utility industry and its customers? The second basic question, how have government agencies responded to the pandemic? And what is their near-term strategy in response to the pandemic's after effects? And the third question is more long-term. It's how will the pandemic affect the electric utility industry in the long term, if at all? And how will it affect the regulatory framework? The experts we have today, and many of you know these four people, and they are truly experts. And there's Ahmad Faruqui, Mark Kolesar, Jim Lazar, and Bruce Williamson. And let me just give you a little thumbnail sketch of their backgrounds, which are all impressive. Ahmad Faruqui is a principal at Brattle, and he's been in has a working experience that goes back 40 years and focuses on customer engagement, including rate design, load flexibility, distributed energy, basically any question you can think of about the electric utility industry. In his career, he's worked with over 150 clients across 5 continents, and he's had 100 papers on energy topics that have been in peer-reviewed journals. He's been cited by The Economist, Bloomberg, Business Week, and Forbes, and has appeared on NPR, Fox, and Fox Business News. And our second speaker, this is just simply in alphabetical order, is Mark Kolesar. He's also, you'll see, quite impressive background. He became the chair of the Alberta Utilities Commission on May 1st, 2018, following 6 years as vice chair. He has long experience in utility costing and rate design that spans 3 decades. He's also been an advisor to the Government of Canada on regulatory matters and appeared before the legislative committees of Parliament of Canada examining Broadcasting Act and Telecom Act. Jim Lazar, again, decades of experience. He's been a consultant in electricity and natural gas since 1982. He's been a principal author of handbooks and articles by the Regulatory Assistance Program, for which he's an advisor to them. And I'll say that my experience is mainly in the telecom industry, when I wanted to learn about the electric utility industry, one of my uh, go-to authors is Jim Lazar. I've read many of his articles, and most recently the cost allocation book that he co-authored. He's probably the principal author of that. He's assisted RAP since 1998, and he also has done projects throughout the world. And our last in alphabetical order is Bruce Williamson. He's a commissioner at Maine Public Utilities Commission since 2015. He's been on the Research Advisory Council of EPRI and vice chair of the FCC North American Numbering Council. He's been a past executive board member of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. He began his career as an energy economist. I know him from his years at Southwestern Bell, where he worked on regulatory issues and then deregulation, and then he eventually branched out into acquisitions of SBC, notably AT&T. And just as an aside, Bruce was part of a group that was widely admired throughout the industry for their expertise and knowledge of the industry. So the format today is going to be a panel discussion moderated by Ahmad, followed by open discussion. And some of the questions that Ahmad will present or ask are the result of the questions submitted to me over the last week or so. And I thank those people for sending those questions in. They were really very pointed and good. And once again, please turn off your microphone and video camera if you're not a presenter. So at that, I will stop sharing this and turn it over to Ahmad.
Thank you very much, Victor. It's a pleasure. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation. I remember about a month ago, you and I started to discuss the topic, and it occurred to us that there was not much known in the area, no papers published yet. And so there was a need to address these questions that everyone kept asking both of us. The questions have not gone away. We now have, in the 1 month that has elapsed, a lot of answers. But I don't know how many of those answers are worth looking at because they're proven wrong every following week. It's a very complex riddle that we're dealing with, as we all know. We don't know how long the pandemic will last. We don't know how many millions will get unemployed. We don't know the size of the stimulus package or packages that will keep on coming. We don't know when the vaccine will be created. And so it's truly an environment that's enveloped with uncertainty. People are stuck at home. Obviously, residential use is going up. But if you're unemployed or you know somebody who's unemployed, you're unable to pay your bills or might soon become unable to pay your bills. So a lot of regulatory assets are being created. Big challenge for utilities, commissions, governments, and legislatures. And actually also for each of us as individual customers. And I'll just make one anecdotal reference to something I read yesterday because I think it sort of at least lightened up my mood in what is obviously a very somber situation. I was reading a book review in The Economist, which is my favorite magazine. I'm sure it is for several of you as well. And it had a whole page-and-a-half long discussion of how to cope with cabin fever, which has now set in a big way. And it referred to some online club that's very active, that people are reading every day, half an hour, 15 pages from the Tolstoy novel, War and Peace. And it's about 800 pages long, so that's got to keep people busy for some time. And apparently it said, and it's been a long time since I read that book, it said it touches on all aspects of the emotional crisis we are going through. There's even a flu in there somewhere. Of course, there's Napoleon and there's everything else. Okay, so what we have are three major questions, and we have three incredibly well-connected, talented, and extremely qualified individuals to address them. The first thing I did when Victor and I were talking was I said, I don't want to speak at the seminar, but I'm more than happy to be the moderator. And so we have reached out. We have been very fortunate in finding these three speakers whose bios you just heard about. And I believe what we will do is I'll just briefly mention to you the three topics that they're going to address, and then we will go through each of the speakers, beginning with Jim Lazar, to address them. We'll address them one question at a time. So the first question, each panelist will speak, then we'll have some discussion on that. Then the next question, each panelist will present, speak, we'll have some discussion. And then the third question. And if we still have some time remaining, we'll have a more open forum kind of a discussion. But before we begin, Victor, is there anything you would like to add by way of process?
No, I think that it might be best for people to submit questions through the chat facility and do it at the end of the presentation so that they don't show up on our screens. That might be the best way to go.
Excellent. Okay, very good. So let me just repeat the questions. The first one is the near-term impact of the pandemic on utilities in terms of earnings, in terms of load shapes, in terms of revenue collection, all of those issues. The second question is the government's response. And the third question is the long-term impact of the pandemic on utilities, on regulators, and broadly speaking, on the regulatory compact, for want of a better term. So let's begin with the first one, the near-term impact. And let's begin with Jim. I believe he has a few slides.
Let me load that.
Well, thanks, Victor and Ahmad. It's great to be here and to be a part of this this webinar. I'm Jim Lazar. I'm an economist and senior advisor with RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project. Am I being heard out there?
Yes.
Okay.
And, can you see your slides?
I can see my slides. So I published a short blog on, Victor, can you dismiss the WebEx meeting reminder on your screen?
Yes.
Thanks. I'm the author of Electricity Regulation in the United States and several other RAP publications, all of which are available for free on RAP's website at raponline.org. I also wrote a short blog post on the COVID crisis now about a month ago. And yes, things have, as Ahmed said, things have changed quite a bit. Let's go to the first slide, Victor. There are four real foundation stones that we teach when we teach Regulation 101. The first is Munn versus Illinois, that the state may regulate businesses that are affected with the public interest. The second is Bluefield Waterworks, that utilities are entitled to an opportunity to earn a fair rate of return that's commensurate with the associated risk.
Could somebody please turn off whatever they're using there? Thank you.
But it's commensurate with the associated risk, and that's important to understand. The third is Hope Natural Gas, in which the court ruled that it's the result reached, not the method employed, that is relevant. And the last, and maybe the most important for this particular crisis, is the Market Street Railway case, where the Supreme Court ruled that regulator is not obliged to protect a non-viable business. In that situation, Market Street Railway was a streetcar line operating in San Francisco. They were losing market share to the automobile, and they asked for a rate increase. The California Public Utility Commission denied that rate increase, and the Supreme Court upheld the CPUC. Market Street Railway later went into bankruptcy. So, those are really the four big cases that are the foundation stones of regulation. Next slide. So now let's come to this crisis. This is a graph of just a couple of weeks of load in New York in late March and early April. And the line at the top is what the 2019 load had been, higher during the weekdays and lower on the weekends, which you expect in a place with lots of office buildings. The dark green line on the bottom is what was experienced in 2020. Substantially lower total consumption, but also much more even consumption from day to day because the office buildings were mostly closed and people were at home and using power at home, but not in their offices. Quite a dramatic change, and this is continuing. I've seen reports in a couple of places that in some countries the load is down as much as 30%. Next. This is one Seattle area hotel, and I've left the vertical axis off to make it impossible to guess whether it's a very, very large one, a medium-sized one, or a small one. It doesn't matter. The blue line at the top was their electricity consumption in the first week of May 2019, higher during part of the day and lower during other parts of the day. The red line at the bottom is that same hotel for the first week of May 2020. Almost no variation at all. The hotel is open. It does have a couple of floors of guest rooms that are operating, but the energy management system and the facilities director are managing the load of the utility within the demand ratchet of their rate design to maintain essentially 100% or more than 90% load factor to minimize the cost of power. And what they're doing is they're flowing dry air into the unused guest rooms at a sufficient rate to prevent mold buildup, but then turning off the air distribution when the guest rooms that are being used or the lobby actually needs power. Pretty clever energy management, but certainly a strategy to minimize their power bill during the crisis. Next. Fuel costs for utilities have gone down. This is from November through the beginning of April, the Henry Hub natural gas prices. They've recovered a little bit since, but demand for oil and natural gas is down, and that is suppressing market prices. That creates a fuel cost savings to utilities. That's pretty substantial. Next. Wholesale electricity prices are running lower than last year and the year before. This is ISO New England average prices for 2018, 2019, and the first 3 months of 2020. Wholesale market prices about 25% lower than last year. This obviously varies from region to region, but here in the Pacific Northwest where I live, last month the high load hours average market price that Bonneville Power reported was under $12 a megawatt hour. So very, very cheap. We have hydro resources that will run. We have wind and solar resources that will run, and fuel consumption is dramatically reduced because those fuel-operated power plants just aren't being dispatched much. Next. The cost of money has declined. This is the one-year Treasury note rates. Took a really quite dramatic decline at the end of February and have stayed near zero. This reduces the utilities' cost of capital for carrying their short-term debt. Most utilities have about 3 to 7% short-term debt in their capital structure. Right now, they're carrying a lot of unpaid bills, and this is an indicator of the cost of capital. They can't borrow at the Treasury rate, but their borrowing rates are typically tied to the Treasury rate. So while their unpaid bills accrual is higher, the interest rate to carry those is dramatically lower, and those tend to offset one another. Next. The 10-year Treasury bond rate is often used as an indicator in setting the utilities' cost of equity capital. And the 10-year Treasury bond rate is down more than 100 basis points since the COVID crisis began. This tells us that utilities that file for rate increases will face some challenges to being allowed to maintain their current rate of return, and I suspect any utilities that have rate decisions in the next 6 months will probably face a reduction in their allowed return on equity. It may cause many utilities to not file for a rate case in order to avoid the exposure to a change in their allowed ROE. But clearly there's some real savings to the benefit of utilities in the cost of capital. Next. The blog post that I published that I encourage you to look at on the COVID crisis, that's at raponline.org and the blog section, is that regulators need to consider all of the impacts of the COVID crisis. There's an overall sales decline, and that hurts utilities. There's an increase in high margin residential sales. That helps. There are lower fuel and purchase power costs. That helps. There are changes in labor costs, both up and down. And I think when we get into the second and third question, we'll talk about some of those. There are clearly higher accounts receivable due to the shutoff moratorium that many states and local jurisdictions have imposed. That hurts. There's a lower cost of capital. That helps. The key for regulators is to consider all of this together so that those that put upward pressure on rates and bills can be offset by those that provide downward pressure. So thanks, and I'll hand it back to you, Ahmad.
Well, thank you very much. I think those are very useful points here. Are you getting an echo?
Yes. Somebody needs to turn off their speaker.
Okay, let me try again. Looks like it went away.
Yes, it did.
Okay, excellent. So what I was saying was that those data points are really very useful as we begin to think about this subject. Obviously, these are issues and challenges for regulators as well as for utilities whom they regulate. So why don't we first turn to the regulatory point of view? We have regulators on the panel, essentially. I know we have utilities signed up, so perhaps when the questions come up, their concerns can be addressed. So why don't we first go to Mark and then to Bruce? So Mark, it's your turn.
All right, thank you. I think there's probably quite a number of people on this webinar who are not well acquainted with the regulatory jurisdiction in Alberta. So I'll just start with a very high level overview. Probably the best context for you, if you're not very familiar, is probably Texas. We probably look more like the state of Texas with respect to our regime. We have a competitive energy only market. We have both competitive and regulated retail. We have regulated distribution and regulated transmission, and we do not have vertically integrated utilities here. So it's very much a disaggregated regulatory model that, as I say, probably looks more like the Texas model than any other jurisdiction that you may know of. So I know that Jim touched on a whole lot of points, and I'm sure we will get to some of those. But let's look at some of what's happened in Alberta since the beginning of the COVID situation. And one of the things that I would like people to understand is Alberta, from an economic perspective, really got a double whammy. So we had, of course, an economic shutdown largely because of the COVID situation, but that was exacerbated significantly by significant reductions in oil prices. As you know, there was a bit of a war going on with Russia and the Middle East with respect to driving oil prices down. And as a result of that, what we've seen in Alberta is that oil prices have largely gone down to levels below what the Alberta domestic production costs are. So that's had a pretty significant impact. So let's talk about, I'll focus on electricity because that seems to be the real heart of what we're here to talk about. Although we also regulate gas distribution, I'm going to focus on what's happening in electricity. So one of the interesting things is that just as we started heading into this particular crisis, some new renewable resources came on side. So the supply side actually went up. There were 2 wind farms and 1 solar farm that came online just about the time that we started to hit this economic downturn, and that added to the supply side against a backdrop of declining demand. What that's done is, I think in part, forced the average pool price down. Now, the pool price is the wholesale energy-only cost of electricity, not the delivered cost, but the actual wholesale cost. So in the month of April, the average price went to $29.29 per megawatt hour. And in May, it went to $26.38 per megawatt hour. And just for comparison, we're talking Canadian dollars here. So if you're trying to compare to the US, there's about on any given day, about a 38 to 40% differential right now between the Canadian dollar and the US. So it does give you some indication relatively of just how low wholesale electricity prices have actually gone here. The average pool price in 2019 was roughly $56. So there's been a pretty significant drop. What we've seen with respect to load is relative to the same month in 2019, in March, the average load in Alberta went up by 0.9% in the month of March. And then it dropped in April by 2.3%. And on a weather normalized basis, in the month of April, dropped an additional 4% relative to the preceding year. Load in May dropped by 6.5% relative to 2019. So the other interesting thing is what the load profile in Alberta actually looks like. In Alberta, the load is primarily driven by rural and industrial load. And during this time, most industrial facilities kept operating. However, industrial load declined by about 10% from March to April. The other interesting thing to note about what happened to the load is the load profile ordinarily on a typical weekday prior to COVID would ramp up from 6 to 9. So from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. And what actually happened is that ramp up has begun an hour sooner. The ramp up has actually started at 5, and the degree of concentration in consumption at around 6 p.m., which is when that peak would hit, has actually gone up. So the peak has actually gone up, and then it of course begins to drop off. So that just gives you some indication of what's actually happened here. All of the utilities, at least all of the regulated utilities in Alberta. I've been in fairly close contact with them throughout all of this. They have fared well, and when I say fared well, I don't necessarily mean economically, but they did a tremendous job of being able to adapt to this particular situation, to do what they needed to do to keep their employees healthy, keep their employees safe, keep the lights on. And, you know, I can honestly say as a regulator, I think they all did a really fine job just being able to adjust and being able to deal with this particular situation. I don't know how the financial results are going to ultimately play out. I don't get to see those for quite some time, but they've certainly done an incredibly credible job just being able to adjust and cope with the current situation. So I think that's all I have to say on this particular topic. And I know Jim raised a few other points that I think I'll be more than happy to comment on when we get to that particular question. So back to you, Ahmad.
Well, thank you very much. That was very insightful. It looks like a very complex interplay, like a jigsaw puzzle that's taking shape month to month in Alberta. And perhaps now we should turn over to Bruce and get the perspective from Maine. So Bruce.
All right. Thank you. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. First of all, as Mark just did for the Alberta system, ISO New England is our regional balancing organization. It's an RTO. And for the most part, I think at this point, all the major utilities are restructured. And that means that the generation is separated from transmission and distribution. So it does change some of the impacts that we're going to be talking about. It also highlights kind of the dilemma that merchant generators are in when sales have decreased. It certainly impacts their survivability, some of whom are struggling already. So I would say in agreement with Mark that it is a little bit too soon to say to have a lot of data. We're waiting to hear from our utilities. We have a inquiry open, a notice of inquiry that was out, deliberated. We had preliminary results delivered on May 15th, but we're still waiting for more information. And that before we start doing anything, we need to have the right information. So I would say that our experience today probably not too much different from other rural states on a weather normalized basis. We have a decline in industry usage, industry load, but our data there is incomplete for comparison. On the commercial load on a weather normalized basis for the largest utility we have, it's 11% lower than 2019 megawatt hours. And for residential customers, we have normalized usage of 7 to 8% above 2019 same period due to the homeschooling and the working from home. So a key checkpoint, because Maine's economy is a little bit different from other states, a key checkpoint for us is what's going to happen in the next 3 months. We have usually have a tremendous summer tourism season. The population of Maine swells by a multiple of 3. With visitors. Some have summer residences and some just come for vacationing. But what's going to happen, we have seen some return of those types of tourists and summer residents. But normally that is a profit season or a good cash flow season for all of our utilities, water, gas, electric. As seasonal residences are turned on or turned up for a 2 or 3 month period. So I would say, as we're going to see all across the United States, that revenues are going to be impacted by the slowing sales on top of the disconnect moratorium for the C19 issue. And that, because that moratorium went into effect in March, it actually overlapped with our winter disconnect moratorium. In Maine, you do not disconnect customers for non-payment between November 15th and April 15th. So this COVID-19 moratorium on disconnects overlaps with that. So we have utilities that have not received payments on bills since November 15th and not having the ability to disconnect those customers. That's going to continue as long as we come to some resolution of it. Jim's point about the cost of capital, you mentioned that the cost of capital, cost of borrowing is declining. I think that's good news in terms of those utilities that have very large accounts receivable outstanding right now. But also, we've already seen requests for refinancing, with refinancing higher cost debt with short-term borrowing, to replace short-term borrowing with the lower cost debt that's now available. So we've already seen that. We're going to see more of that in the future. I also want to emphasize cash flow for smaller utilities. Cash flow, as I mentioned, summer season is very important for them to get well. And now it's in an uncertain state. That's not our investor owns, those tend to be our consumer owned utilities. Let's see, just a couple other comments. So as delinquent accounts are piling up, Farhad, maybe it was Jim who mentioned, I'm not sure. When we're talking about regulatory assets, that is something that we need to consider in the state because these uncollectibles are sizable. I don't want to give away any confidential information on one utility, but very, very large. And it could get worse. So we have to figure out a way to unwind that over time. And then work on a glide path for repayments for customers because unemployment has also been quite pronounced in Maine. And I do also want to mention that it's very important. Jim was talking about rate cases. And I think it's important in this conversation to be clear that we need to consider, rather than making generalizations, we need to be considering where a utility was in the rate case prior to this, because those utilities are in a different group. For example, two of our large IOU electric companies completed rate cases in the beginning part of the year before this, and our largest gas company also completed a rate case. And they're going to be in a different situation as utilities that have already had a rate case, and they had a test year. Test years are going to be very controversial. And it's going to be different for those who have yet to enter a rate case or were planning one. So just in the case of Maine, our utilities have had recent rate cases, and how we deal with their accounts receivable is going to be a long, difficult process. I had some other comments, but I think that's good enough for now, and we can go on to further discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I have one question for the panel. My question is, based on what I've heard, it looks like there is no issue with keeping the lights on. It looks like in all of the parts of the country that you have touched upon, parts of North America, I should say, and based on what I have read as well, there have been no huge reliability issues, no power outages, et cetera, et cetera. The operators, the power plant people have not been affected by the pandemic, rendering their operations difficult. It looks like residential sales might actually have gone up, even though commercial industrial sales have come down. Does it strike you, and I'm asking this of the three of you, that we are fine, or are we in a crisis? Or are we not in a crisis is my question. Because if you look at hotels and airlines, they are clearly in a crisis. They are devastated. They're ruined. Retail has been hit very hard, not just short term, but long term. People say, well, but the lights are on and the utilities must be fine. So do we need to worry about this? Do we need to change our regulatory paradigm? Or are we equipped? This is just a bump in the road and we'll ride it out. And why don't I leave it that as the question? And Bruce, why don't we begin with you and go in reverse sequence? Bruce, Mark, and then Jim. 2 minutes each.
Okay. My first point is the cash flow, the importance of cash flow. And I think the industries you talked about that are severely affected. Retail, transportation are particularly impacted by cash flow. And we'll see that with our smaller utilities. That's going to be a serious issue in Maine over the summertime. With our larger utilities, I am of the view that this is a big bump in the road, but not a fatal bump in the road for large utilities. I might see that those nationally that are relatively weak in how they've managed things or their treatment from regulators may be targets for acquisition, but that's just the industry kind of reshuffling or rebalancing things as time goes on. But I think it's painful because it involves consumers who are unemployed, unable to pay, and it's going to be painful and difficult to work out solutions that are fair and reasonable. 6-8 months.
Great, thank you. Mark?
Well, I think it's maybe the jury's out as to whether or not we could be potentially looking at any sort of a crisis. I mean, it really depends on how long this is going to last. One of the things that I think you have to keep in mind is that these are regulated monopolies that cannot exit the market. They have to keep the lights on. They have to keep going. It's part of the regulatory bargain. There's no indication yet, at least as far as I can tell, in our jurisdiction that any of the utilities that we currently regulate are in any sort of a financial crisis. But the reality is they bear the risk of reductions in billing determinants. And they obviously have an incentive to retain customers, to keep bills paid. They're all, I'm sure, taking reasonable steps to try to manage as best they can those individuals who are less able to keep their bills paid. And it'll be interesting to see when the sort of current moratorium, I think, as Bruce put it, we have the same thing here, against people being cut off comes to an end. What kind of steps are the utilities going to take to try to deal with the reduction in their billing determinants? Clearly, it's to their advantage to keep as much revenue coming in the door as they possibly can. And it does raise some interesting questions that, quite frankly, I don't know the answers to. If you think about what the heart of this webinar is about, is what are the implications for the regulatory bargain? And it really raises a question about how much protection do utilities need from the impact of events that are outside of their control. And a lot of events that are happening now are really outside of their control. They affect the economy at large. So what does the regulatory bargain say about how much protection we should be required to afford the utilities, recognizing the regulatory bargain as it is? And also, I think when you try to find an answer to that question, one of the questions that you have to ask yourself is how much risk coming about as a result of events such as this has already been factored into the regulated returns that they get, and how much of this is so unique that we need to rethink it. And I don't know, I mean, that we have an answer. And even if I thought I had one as a regulator, I certainly couldn't share it. And it doesn't matter what my view is. What does matter is, where does the public interest lie? So I think we as regulators, if the impacts, the economic impacts of COVID drag on for a really extended period of time, we're going to have some really difficult issues that we're going to face as regulators that really go to the heart of what's the regulatory bargain all about. So I haven't answered your question. I've simply put more questions onto the table, but
I think what you brought out,
crisis yet.
what you have brought out is that this is a philosophical issue to some extent. It has many different answers. It's like in the nature of a Socratic dialogue. There is no cut and dry solution. I know many other questions have come up, which I will ask, but let me give Jim a chance. And Jim, if you wouldn't mind, because we still have two other questions to address, maybe give us a 2-minute response, and then we'll keep it going. And I'm hoping we can get to some of these other questions that are now coming in, perhaps after the second round has occurred. So Jim, over to you.
Thanks, Ahmad. I think the second and third round will go faster. Clearly, we have some bumps in the road. I don't think it amounts to a crisis, but bumps in the road can be serious. A bump in the road can affect your suspension and make it difficult to steer a safe course. A bump in the road can toss you into the ditch. Utilities have taken steps to form their employees into teams. Some of them see sequestering key operating employees, paying them essentially 24 hours a day in order to have them not return to their families, to maintain the control rooms. The ISOs have double-staffed their redundant control rooms to try and make sure things aren't badly upset by an illness in one of them. Those are going to add some labor costs. There's some utility, very high commercial and industrial loads that are going to be pretty hard hit by this. Others that have primarily residential loads will have an easier time. But even those utilities have deferred collections, and regulators are going to have to deal with the amount of deferred collection. Few utilities have automatic adjustment, automatic recovery of uncollectibles. Most do not. Some wholesale suppliers, and I think Mark's point about the wholesale prices in Alberta, there may be some wholesale suppliers that cannot financially weather this, and I'd be interested as we get later in the program in hearing Mark's response on that. And finally, utilities that have decoupling mechanisms that protect them from changes in sales volumes will have in some cases pretty major adjustments before regulators, and this will test the stability and future applicability of those decoupling mechanisms. So some of the bumps on the road are pretty big.
Great. And I do believe you already answered a question that was asked about decoupling. And, that question has been put to me numerous times as well. If you have decoupling, are you insulated? And I'm saying, okay, so if the rate increase is minor, you're probably okay. But if it was a big rate increase, then this might be viewed as an exceptional circumstance, which overrides the normal automatic pass-through. But let's hold off on that. So let's get to the second question, which deals with the response of governments. What has been the response of governments, federal, provincial, or state, or local? And how do you see that mitigating some of the challenges posed by the pandemic? And how about if we begin with Bruce on that question, and then go to Mark, and then to Jim? Bruce?
Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to go lightly over the CARES Act because that is something that I have not looked into. We've been far more focused on the actual state of affairs with Maine's utilities. So we've got a two-pronged approach, very much like the other states are doing in the region. That's the disconnect moratorium, protecting those hardest hit and unable to pay their bills. And secondly, as I mentioned, we had opened a notice of inquiry, and so have other states or equivalent adjudicatory proceedings to gather information rather than jump to conclusions at this point. So we're using this to inform a potential follow-on proceeding or investigation. And as I mentioned earlier, our notice of inquiry covers all utilities because they're all having difficulties. What I wanted to say about the government is specifically the state government. They are the missing party at the table right now in Maine, and that may be true in other states too. They meet time and they have an election coming up in the next couple months, 3 months. So because everyone is running for office due to term limits, 2 years, since everyone is running for office, what can happen after these elections may add additional requirements for the commission to carry out in the spring. I'm almost certain there will be because they are very responsive to consumers. So I think that it's an open question exactly what's going to happen, but the commission in Maine has already started a process basically to be well informed when the new legislature is seated in early January. So right now, they're the missing party at the table. The big question mark: what's going to happen when they come back in decision? We'll have to see, but we're taking all the steps that we can do possibly at this point.
Excellent. Thank you. Mark?
Okay, well, in Alberta, the provincial government made a request that there should be a 90-day bill payment deferral. It's completely optional on behalf of the individual customer. They can choose to defer or not. It's not a holiday, it's a deferral. So they can simply defer the payment of their bills. There's a fairly complex program that's been put into place to make that happen. I won't go through all of the nuts and bolts of it, but you can imagine that trying to coordinate that in a regulatory environment such as we have here, where we don't have vertically integrated utilities, was a rather large task to try to sort out how to make the mechanics of a deferral program like that work. And to a great extent, it was backstopped by the provincial government. There's a couple of mechanisms that were put in place to make that happen. And again, I won't go into all of the details with respect to how it works, but it probably took us about 2 months to sort out how to make it work. And it required some legislative change, some of which gave this commission some jurisdiction that it didn't previously have, in order to be able to make all of the logistics work. So we thought when we initially launched this, this deferral program is available to essentially residential, small commercial, and farm rate classes. That's a fairly broad brush category, but to give it some context, if a customer uses less than 250,000 kilowatt hours of electricity in a year, they would qualify and they would be able to make a request that they could take part in the billing deferral. When we originally looked at this, we thought there might be as much as a 30% uptake, which over 90 days would take about $300 million of cash flow out of the utility sector. What we actually found thus far is that the amount of uptake is significantly less than what we thought it would be. Some of the retailers indicated that only about 10% of their customers actually have taken advantage of it. So the uptake isn't as big as what we thought it would be. The other thing that's happened is there was quite a bit of stimulus put into the economy as a whole at various levels, even either at the provincial government level or at the federal government level. And to a certain extent, that may have ameliorated some of the need for rate relief on behalf of the utilities. There was a call for some rate relief or some support for large commercial and industrial consumers. We're still trying to sort through that. We haven't come up with a plan for them as yet. And if you think about Jim's hotel example, I found that chart really interesting. the real challenge for a lot of the large commercial or large industrials, and if we use his hotel as an example, usually their rates have a demand charge built in based on a ratchet and some sort of a minimum bill. Usually, I don't know how rate structures elsewhere work, but for the most part, those ratchets are usually based on highest coincident peak in the previous year. Well, if you think about what's happening in the last few months, your ratchet is nowhere close to what your actual demand in the current situation is. And so what we had was, if we use Jim's hotel example, you've got a hotel that either has its doors completely closed or is maybe only running, you know, 1 or 2 floors. So although their demand looks really small, their actual real demand may be even lower than that chart that Jim put up. And in effect, they're, you know, had raised concerns that these demand charges were even higher than what they could actually afford. And so, although I don't have any data to support it, I think a lot of utilities are struggling with trying to provide some sort of billing support for a lot of larger commercial entities that are simply not in a situation to pay their bills based on the rate structures that we have. And it's yet to be seen sort of how long the economic wash from this current situation is going to last. And as we head down the road, you know, we need to be thinking about sort of, are there going to be longer term relief requirements beyond the relief requirements that we have now? And as we think about, in particular, the large commercial or large consumer sector, the debate has become, do you need short-term rate relief like the 90-day plan? Or do we need to start looking at a longer term approach to what the economic recovery plan may look like, and a potential to look at maybe significant sustained rate reductions or potentially rate restructuring? And none of that is easy, because in the end, it's kind of a zero-sum game. You have to get the money somewhere, and it's very unclear how we're going to deal with that, and it's certainly not easily implemented. I mean, trying to think through significant rate restructuring and going through whatever steps you'd have to go through as a regulator to provide for that is not a very easy task, and not one that can be done very quickly. So that may be the kind of issues that those of us on the call that are regulators are going to have to face, and it's going to take some serious thought about how to deal with those longer term implications. So
in some sense, we have already gotten into the third question, and what I think I'll ask Jim to do, if Jim, that works for you, is address a little bit question number 2, but let's begin to talk about the longer term challenges as well. So why don't I let you respond to both questions 2 and 3, and then we'll go back in reverse. And before Jim, you make your comment, if I can interject as the moderator a couple of observations based on what I've heard so far. By the way, this is an incredibly comprehensive discussion, and I think this is going to require more than 90 minutes to do justice to it. We might want to come back to it in 6 weeks' time and maybe see what we have learned in the next 6 weeks. So here are my 2 statements. One statement focusing on the hotel as a metaphor for large commercial enterprises that are hit hard by the pandemic. They can't even afford to pay the salaries of their workers or their rent. So why should electricity be an exception? Why should a ratcheted demand charge come into them and say, oh, by the way, you have this to pay regardless of whether you're bankrupted or not? I think it's going to be an issue that will transcend regulation. It'll go into the economic sphere and the governmental sphere. and ultimately the media will pick it up too. So it is like, as you said, and has been pointed out, ultimately this will all depend on the severity of the economic downturn. There are studies by the Trump administration that suggest the US economy will take off like a rocket in the third and the fourth quarter, and we'll be better off than we ever were in times past. Then there's the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of the US who has said it's not going to happen until the end of 2022, in other words, December 2022. And then you have a Professor Bloom at Stanford in the Graduate School of Business who's saying it'll take 5 years. And that assumes that a vaccine and a medical solution is found early into next year. So you have a lot of unknowns between several qualified experts about the duration and the severity of the economic downturn. So having said that, let me now turn to Jim and see, Jim, what thoughts does that trigger in you?
Thanks, Ahmad. You described this as a jigsaw puzzle a little bit ago. But usually with a jigsaw puzzle, you get all these little parts inside the box, but there's a picture on the outside of the box that shows you what it's supposed to be when you get it all put together. And we don't have that picture. We don't know what's ahead of us in this crisis. We really have more unknowable unknowns than maybe anything I've ever encountered in my life. Some of the government efforts to respond have been helpful. The financial support to the financial markets in terms of liquidity, the Fed agreeing to buy $2 trillion of commercial paper has ensured that utilities can borrow and has lowered their cost of debt. And that's very positive. The financial support from the federal government and state governments to both companies and to displaced workers has enabled some companies and some displaced workers to continue to pay their utility bills. Those that are worked in conventional jobs and have conventional unemployment are in better shape than work in the gig economy. The shut-off moratoriums have created large deferrals of people not paying their bills currently, and regulators are going to have to deal with that, and some of them are already dealing with it, and it's not going to be a trivial matter. The final government effort, the one that's most distressing to me, and I mentioned this just a moment ago, is that the testing capability is essential to having people return to work, to know that the workplace you're going into is safe. And vaccine development is essential, and the abdication of a federal role here is a matter of real considerable distress. If there's one thing, I mean, in my opinion, that's even more important than the Fed's $2 trillion liquidity movement. So those are my comments on the government effects. I'm now going to shift to the third question, to sort of the long-run impact. I think the first long-run impact that occurs to me as an analyst may not be the one that occurs to the people who are going to make decisions, is that I think it is driving home the importance of electric reliability, particularly for residential customers. If you have to stay home, it's really important that the power is on. And the moratorium on disconnects has addressed the financial issue, but the physical reliability elements, I think, are going to become recognized as more and more important. And we saw a little taste of this in Bangladesh, where the cyclone approached and people had to get out of where home was and go somewhere upland, which is a little challenging in parts of Bangladesh. And we're not seeing Bangladesh having some of the highest number of new cases of COVID anywhere in the world. And I think that clearly, if social distancing is impossible, it's a problem. If you can't leave home to go to a shelter, either for cooling or for heating, without risking your life, it's more important for the residential reliability to be important. Utilities are going to see a permanent loss of some customers. And Ahmed's mentioned some of these. Retail, hotel, travel, restaurants. I think it's going to be a very long time before those loads recover. They're also seeing some gain of some customers in e-commerce, residential sales, internet service providers, telecom. I don't think those are going to come close to offsetting the loss of customers. We're going to see rate design changes. Utilities, I think, have been and will continue. Is my audio still good? I'm getting no video here now.
You're getting what?
I'm getting no video, but if my audio is good, that's all.
Your audio is fine. I thought you turned off your video. I didn't want to say anything.
Okay.
I got a message saying that the connection at Jim's end was being challenged. I thought it was for me, but I'm still connected. I think Jim is just the
My
internet.
audio is good. That's all. That's all. Ahmed mentioned the issue of demand ratchet. There are several states where commercial customers have requested relief from their demand ratchets. Those demand ratchets are part of the offset for the high risk that particularly industrial customers pose to utilities because their sales and revenues are tied to the business cycle. And in cost of capital cases, industrial customers have argued they should not be subject to a higher return requirement than other classes. And the principal reason they give is that the demand ratchets provide stability of revenue. That's going to be challenged in the long run. Utilities may seek higher fixed charges. They have been, but we just had a decision this week in New Hampshire specifying that fixed charges should be limited to the customer-specific costs of billing, collection, and service drop. I think we're going to see real changes in the role of energy efficiency and customer self-supply, and these work together. I think as customers see the importance of home reliability higher, they're going to want to have, as Ahmed does, their solar system tied to an on-site battery, but as Ahmed doesn't have the ability to island that house, and if the utility is not supplying power, to be able to operate their house off of their home battery and charge that battery with their home solar system. That's going to take some changes in the interconnection rules. We're seeing that already in some states. But once you get to where you're depending on your solar system and your batteries are expensive, solar systems are expensive, and energy efficiency is relatively cheap, and the incentive to improve the efficiency of your building is enhanced. So those are some things that I see as changing in the long run, and I want to hear my colleagues.
Yeah, and I think that was great. If I can just add a footnote to the questions for the two other panelists, it has come up on the side. There's this general concern that the pandemic, by creating mass unemployment, economic hardship and distress, and resulting in challenges for paying bills for customers to pay their bills to utilities, that might basically be a negative development for energy efficiency, renewable energy like solar and batteries, because they're very expensive. If you don't have a job, the last thing you want to do is spend $20,000 to $30,000 putting in solar with battery as a backup for the times when power would be out. And so as you respond, Bruce and Mark, to the longer term challenge, if you can also address the issue of what does this mean for clean energy? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? The fact that we had this shock administered to us, and to restate the obvious, the shock hasn't gone yet. The shock is still here. It's like a snake in the room we cannot see. We think the snake's gone, but the snake could come back. So the challenge is multi-layered. So why don't we begin with Bruce? Then Mark will get to have the closing words.
All right. Okay. Well, maybe if I'll get to that question in just a moment, Ahmad. The larger question of what do we think about the regulatory compact in the long term and what's going to happen with it? Well, this may be a bit contrarian, but I think the regulatory framework is intact and it's going to be needed more than ever. Why am I saying that? It remains a fact that since commissions were started more than 100 years ago in most cases, they are first and foremost the creatures of legislatures. And probably, I would say in the case of what I see in New England, 65, in some cases, maybe even 75% of the workload each year involves dealing with new statutory requirements that the legislature says this is the way regulation is going to be done, or it involves existing regulations that need to be applied to utilities. So in both cases, the commission is carrying out the political will of the legislatures. But as has been true since the beginning, legislatures don't have the time or the required to do all this themselves, to be economic regulators. So, and they don't have much appetite either, as it seems to be in the line of fire when statutes have expensive consequences, and that's what commissions are there for. So some of the measures that may be necessary, Ahmad, you referred to something essentially spreading the pain because it is an economic downturn at the same time. Some of these measures may end up on ratepayers or customer bills. So commissions are going to be in a difficult spot of finding fair and reasonable ways to adjudicate the division of costs. And we have to keep in mind that in the end, there's only one wallet. The wallet is the customer, is the consumer. That one wallet, either out of taxes or out of utility bills, has got to support an awful lot of things in our economy. So I think a lot of things are unknown here, but ultimately we have to carry out whatever the legislatures put in front of us. As for energy efficiency and clean energy, I think the problem there in New England is the prevalence of government as a buyer or an arranger of energy through long-term contracts and power purchase agreements. There have been some that have a least cost flavor to them and were competitive, but there have been many in the last decade that are above market, and they're going to be a drag on recovery because those sales of electricity is above the wholesale cost of electricity in New England, and it's going to remain contracts in some cases. That's going to be a drag. That's going to be a headwind in recovery. So energy efficiency, I did want to make one comment I didn't mention earlier. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is probably going to face lower lower price bids for allowances in their quarterly auctions as a result of fewer plants, fewer power plants, fewer industrial sites operating. So and the RGGI funds, not in all states, but in states I'm familiar with, those funds are energy efficiency investments. So there may be a drop in funding available for efficiency investments, although I think Massachusetts is committed to $1 billion a year for 3 years. Maine is 65 million a year, which is, for Maine, it's a much smaller population, is a substantial amount. Even if that drops with RGGI funding dropping a little bit in the next few quarters, there's still funding available for efficiency. I agree with Jim, it's the lowest cost way of doing continuing to operate through this COVID problem. So clean energy, I would say, where we can get that energy at a least cost way, that's probably the wisest thing we can do because it gives us the greatest resilience in dealing with economic recovery. it's going to take time. I agree. Between the three experts you cited, Ahmad, three sources, people were very skeptical how quickly the economy would come back after the banking and mortgage crisis a few years ago. I think it came back a little quicker than some were saying. I'm hoping that's the case here, but I'm afraid we're in a new normal world.
Great. I actually was going to ask that question that you touched upon, which is how does this compare, this recession that we are living through that has not ended yet? What would people writing a book 10 years out, what will they say when they compare the impact of this recession with the one that occurred in 2008, 2009? And I want to put that question to Mark. Mark, it's your turn. We have 11 minutes remaining. How about if you take about 8 of those minutes, and then I'm going to turn it back to Victor for a wrap up so that we finish on time.
Okay, I think it's yet to be seen how this is going to compare to the last financial crisis. I know at the time we saw an inversion that I think we're not seeing this time, but maybe that's yet to be seen. Maybe if this drags on enough, we will see that. I just want to touch on a few things, and some of which is to maybe respond to some of what Jim said. So the first thing I'd like to talk about from a regulator's perspective is the uniqueness of the year 2020. And as we think about how we're going to turn our minds to rate setting, we need to think about what kind of information does 2020 really give us. I think Jim correctly pointed out there's going to be a bunch of different puts and takes. I've always been of the view that the job of a really successful regulator is to think about regulation from the perspective of the incentives that you create, the incentives that you create for the market to respond to what utilities do, and the incentives you create within utilities themselves to behave in a way that gives you the right outcome from a public policy or from a public good perspective. And I've also very much been of the view that the greatest incentive that you have to drive a utility to get the right public interest outcome is the incentive to make a profit, which is why we've been advocates of performance-based regulation in this particular jurisdiction. So there's going to be a lot of puts and takes. I think when we start thinking about the next cycle of how rates will be set, we need to be thinking about what's actually happened and what has happened on the revenue side, what's happened on the cost side. We think about all of those puts and takes that Jim actually talked about. And I think to the extent that the profit incentive for utilities has not been too dulled or blunted by the various government incentives, it'll be interesting to see how much the utilities have seen this as an opportunity to find ways to reduce costs. It's interesting that the incentive to find ways to reduce costs is really an exercise in responding to the situation that you're in. It's a process of discovery, and I think this year provides a great opportunity for utilities to undertake that process of discovery. So even if we just think about the working from home trend, so the working from home trend, I think is going to have huge implications in the economy. It's going to have huge implications for the customers of the utilities, and potentially huge implications for the utilities themselves. If a company realizes that they can be very efficient having people work at home, why even bother with people at home? Why not go offshore? Why do I even need to hire locally if I can reduce my costs by hiring somebody in some other country? And we've seen a lot of those particular trends. And even just the working from home trend, there's a telco in Canada that I worked for a very long time before I came to this role. They actually took on the working from home trend years ago. They understood that they had the technology to do it. And a lot of their employees simply work from home. They don't have an office. They work from home all the time. So I think we could see some really interesting trends in efficiency improvements coming out of this year. But there's certainly the possibility that the loss of load and the changes in load profile and the impact that's going to have on billing may be sustained for quite some time. And that may require us to, as I said before, look at some longer term alternatives for how we're going to weather that storm. I'd also like to pick up on Jim's thoughts about what's the potential impact on the weighted average cost of capital. Jim seems to be pretty firmly of the view that it's going to go down. I think it might be too soon to actually tell. So one of the questions we might want to ask ourselves is this some sort of a black swan? Have we really seen a black swan event here? And even if we haven't, even if some of what we're looking at here might have been contemplated as a potential risk by investors, when that risk actually occurs, I think one of the questions that investors ask themselves is, well, gee, that risk did actually occur. Does the impact of it actually occurring have an impact on what market expectations are after a potential risk has actually come to pass? So I think it's really too soon to say, has there been a shift in the risk profile? And even though the cost of debt has gone down significantly, one of the questions that regulators are going to have to turn their mind to is, has the market risk premium actually gotten larger as a result of what's going on here? So I think it's way too soon to say anything definitive about what the weighted average cost of capital for utilities might actually go to. And one of the things that regulators may have to be thinking about, particularly if this economic downturn lasts for a significant period of time, is, are there measures that a regulator can undertake to limit the impact on the utilities credit metrics? And in fact, in this jurisdiction in the past, we've actually done things like that. For example, we have adopted QIP in rate base for some period of time, purely for the purpose of shoring up credit metrics to get FFO to debt within some reasonable range, so that you don't end up with a significant impact on credit metrics. So I think regulators are going to have to be thinking about all of those things as we think about what the potential impacts on the weighted average cost of capital for utilities and therefore impacts on rates might be. The last thing I want to touch on is when we start looking at the longer term alternatives for how we weather this economic storm, and we start thinking about the potential for rate restructuring, I think we need to be thinking about things like when we restructure rates that may favor a particular rate group, we are either implicitly or explicitly building subsidies into the rate structure. And there's implications there. There's implications for the price signals you put into the market. And there's implications for how the market's going to behave in response to that. And so I think you've really got to turn your mind to how is the public interest served when you start fooling around with, and that's probably not a good term, but when you start thinking about how you might restructure rates, you've got to be thinking about what all those implications are. You also have to think about what some of the intertemporal impacts are. when you start thinking about the potential to defer billing, you start thinking about the potential to defer capital expenditure, those intertemporal impacts have implications, and they're not easy ones to deal with. If you think about it as like a big net present value issue, how do you even determine what the right discount rate is? There's a lot of debate over what the appropriate social discount rate might be. When you start looking at those types of intertemporal issues, and I think as regulators, we'll be needing to think about those things as we think about how might we deal with this, with these issues long term. And just let me conclude by saying it's unlikely that we're going to get a Pareto efficient outcome. I think the issue is really complex, but maybe at best we might get a Calder-Hicks improvement of some kind, if we can figure out how to restructure rates in some reasonable way. So back to you. Oh, I guess the last thing you wanted to ask about was potential impact on renewables. There's very few small scale renewables here, largely because of the type of climate we're in. They all tend to be large scale. So I don't know that there's going to be a huge impact here, at least not in the short term. But we're just at the tail end of doing a rather significant inquiry into distributed energy resources in Alberta. We'll be issuing a report soon. And obviously, we're turning our minds to what changes do we need to make to the regulatory regime in Alberta to position us for further adoption of distributed energy resources. So some of what's going on here may have an influence on what we do with that. So I think I took more than my 8 minutes.
But you added a lot of wisdom and perspective, so that's incredible. It looks like some of these questions have no easy answers, and it looks like many of the questions it's too early to answer them because the drama is still unfolding. It reminds me of a statement from Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier. He was asked, what has been the impact of the French Revolution on world history? And his answer was, it's too early to say. So I mean, obviously, we're talking about a very different issue there, but in many ways, this drama, I mean, the 2008, 2009 recession ended, and people kept asking what would be the impact 5, 6 years after it had ended. Even then, there was no consensus. And it took 10 years for load growth, for example, to return to its pre-recession level in the US. This one is still happening, it's still unfolding. So how can we predict what will happen? Because what is happening now hasn't ended yet. But I think we helped stimulate a lot of thinking, a lot of questions came, some of which we addressed, some of which we couldn't because of lack of time. I really think perhaps we should revisit this in about 6 to 8 weeks. And in the meantime, Victor, I'll turn it back to you, and you can tell us how do you intend to sustain this momentum. I'm really encouraged by the huge turnout, by the questions, by the points made by the speakers and the panelists. So I think that this is going to be around. It won't go away. I wish it would. Honestly, I wish this webinar was not happening in many ways, but it is happening, and the problems and challenges will continue. So back to you, Victor, to say the closing words.
Thanks very much, Ahmad. And interestingly, you brought up War and Peace. If you remember, one of the points that Tolstoy seemed to have made is during the battles, everybody had opinions and they had strategies, and it turned out that it was individual initiative and surprise tactics that nobody even thought about that were critical for success in battle. And right now, I think we're right in the midst of it, where we're in the midst of this dislocation, and there are many possibilities, many reasonable alternatives. But I agree with you 100% that we need to have snapshots of what's going on. Maybe in another maybe in 6 weeks or so, we would have a better view of the battlefield and see what strategies are actually working, and it does seem like there's issues here that are so difficult to solve. It was brought up, how much support, how much this regulatory bargain, how much does government support the companies? How much support needs to go to customers, to special groups? And there's only one wallet, as Bruce said, and it's a real difficulty. So anyway, I'll end there, and I think that this has been a wonderful discussion, very insightful, and I think for the people who've been here, who've listened to this, it's very clear that we did have a panel of experts who had great insights into very difficult problems. So thanks again, Ahmad, Bruce, Mark, and Jim. Wonderful job.